In July 2024, a convoy of Russian mercenaries and Malian soldiers rolled through the Sahara toward the village of Tinzaouaten. They were hunting a man who had survived 4 decades of desert wars, French airstrikes, and international manhunts. Within hours, 84 Russians and 47 Malian troops were dead, their vehicles scattered across the sand. The man they were looking for never appeared at the battle. He didn't need to. His network had already won. This is the story of Iyad Ag Ghaly, a Tuareg noble who became a warlord, a diplomat, a jihadist commander, and the architect of the Sahel's most resilient criminal empire. Governments negotiated with him, paid him, and then declared him a global terrorist. The International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest. Wagner Group mercenaries died trying to kill him. Yet for nearly 40 years he moved through the desert untouched. How does one man survive that long in a region where everyone else gets killed or captured? And if his end has finally arrived, what does that mean for the chaos he built? Iyad Ag Ghaly was born in the mid-1950s in Abibara, a remote settlement in the Kidal region of what was then French Sudan. His family belonged to the Iriayakan, a branch of the Ifoghas Tuareg. In the rigid social order of the Tuareg people, the Ifoghas occupy the top. They are the traditional rulers, the religious authorities, the ones who settle disputes and command loyalty across tribal lines. Being born Ifoghas gave Ag Ghaly something no foreign jihadist could ever replicate: automatic legitimacy in the north. When he spoke, people listened. When he gave orders, they were followed. That birthright would define everything that came after. The Tuareg social structure operates on a hierarchical system that has survived centuries of colonial rule and post-independence upheaval. At the apex sit the Ifoghas, who trace their lineage back to the original Arab conquerors who brought Islam to the Sahara. Below them are the Imgad, or warrior vassals, who provide military support in exchange for protection. Further down are the craftsmen, the blacksmiths, and finally the enslaved or formerly enslaved populations. This structure is not merely ceremonial. It determines access to resources, political influence, and the ability to mobilize fighters across vast distances. Ag Ghaly understood this system intimately because he was born into its highest tier. In 1963, when Ag Ghaly was roughly 7 years old, his father was killed during the First Tuareg Rebellion. Ghaly Ag Babakar had served in the French colonial army and advised Tuareg elites. Reports suggest a rebel commander shot him in the head, mistaking him for a different government official. The newly independent Malian state responded to the rebellion with brutal military reprisals against northern populations. Entire communities were displaced. Livestock was slaughtered. Wells were poisoned. The Malian army, composed primarily of soldiers from the south, viewed the Tuareg with suspicion and contempt. The resentment toward Bamako, the capital in the south, became generational. The death of his father left a mark on Ag Ghaly that would shape his worldview. He grew up in a community that felt betrayed by the promise of independence. The French had left, but the new Malian state offered nothing in return: no infrastructure, no investment, no political representation. The north was treated as a colonial possession by Bamako, a place to extract resources and ignore. For a young boy of noble birth, watching his father's death go unpunished and his community suffer systematic neglect, the seeds of rebellion were planted early. Then came the droughts of the 1970s. Severe environmental collapse decimated the nomadic herds that formed the basis of Tuareg wealth. The Sahel experienced a series of droughts between 1968 and 1974 that killed millions of animals and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. Young men had no livelihood. The traditional economy based on pastoralism and trans-Saharan trade collapsed. Thousands migrated to Libya and Algeria, where Muammar Gaddafi was recruiting a revolutionary army from displaced Sahelians. These displaced youth called themselves the Ishumar, a term derived from the French word chômage, meaning unemployed. Ag Ghaly joined them in 1972. He was in his late teens, educated enough to speak French and Arabic, and angry enough to fight. In Libya, Ag Ghaly transitioned from a displaced intellectual into a trained paramilitary operative. Gaddafi's training camps were part of his broader Pan-African and Pan-Arab revolutionary project. He envisioned Libya as the vanguard of a new anti-imperialist order that would unite oppressed peoples across Africa and the Middle East. The Tuareg, with their grievances against French colonialism and Malian neglect, fit perfectly into this narrative. Gaddafi provided them with weapons, military training, and a sense of purpose. The camps taught desert survival, guerrilla tactics, and the basics of irregular warfare. Ag Ghaly learned how to navigate the Sahara using stars and landmarks, how to conserve water in extreme heat, and how to move large groups of fighters across vast distances without detection. He learned how to use small arms, mortars, and improvised explosives. He learned how to set up ambushes and how to retreat when outnumbered. These skills would serve him for the rest of his life. Between 1980 and 1982, Ag Ghaly was sent to Lebanon and Syria, where he fought alongside the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This was a formative experience. Lebanon in the early 1980s was a laboratory of irregular warfare. Multiple factions, Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, and Israeli, were fighting for control of a fractured state. The conflict was characterized by urban warfare, hostage-taking, and the systematic use of terror against civilian populations. Ag Ghaly absorbed these tactics. He saw how ideology could be used to mobilize fighters. He saw how media attention could amplify the impact of relatively small operations. He saw how hostage negotiations could generate revenue and political leverage. By the time he returned to Libya in the mid-1980s, Ag Ghaly had become part of Gaddafi's Green Legion, a paramilitary force that operated across the Sahel and in Chad. The Green Legion was involved in Gaddafi's attempts to annex the Aouzou Strip, a uranium-rich territory on the Chad-Libya border. Ag Ghaly participated in these operations, gaining advanced military training and building a network of Sahelian dissidents who would later form the core of his own movements. He met fighters from Niger, Mauritania, and Algeria. He learned how to coordinate operations across multiple fronts. He learned how to manage logistics in a region with no infrastructure. When Ag Ghaly finally returned to Kidal in the late 1980s, he was no longer just another angry young man. He was a strategist. With nearly 2 decades of combat experience and a network of contacts across the Sahel and the Middle East, he understood how to use violence as a political tool. He understood how to negotiate from a position of strength. And he understood that in a region where the state was absent, the man who could provide security and justice would command loyalty. On the night of June 28, 1990, Ag Ghaly led the popular movement for the liberation of Azawad in coordinated attacks on the towns of Tiderman and Menaka. 18 people were killed, including 4 Malian soldiers. The raids announced the beginning of a renewed Tuareg rebellion. Ag Ghaly quickly established himself as the undisputed leader. His tactical successes and his ability to think several steps ahead earned him the nickname the Strategist among both his followers and his enemies. The 1990 rebellion was different from the 1963 uprising. The Ishumar who returned from Libya were better armed, better trained, and more politically sophisticated. They had contacts with foreign governments and revolutionary movements across Africa and the Middle East. They had access to weapons that the Malian army could not match. And they had a clear objective: autonomy for the north, or, if necessary, full independence. Ag Ghaly's strategy was to demonstrate that the Malian government could not control the north. He launched hit-and-run attacks on military outposts, ambushed convoys, and seized control of small towns. The Malian army, demoralized and poorly equipped, struggled to respond. Soldiers were often stationed in remote outposts with limited supplies and no reinforcements. When rebels attacked, they either surrendered or fled. The government in Bamako faced a choice: negotiate or commit to a protracted war it could not afford. But Ag Ghaly's real power wasn't in seizing territory, it was in negotiating. In January 1991, he signed the Tamanrasset Accords in Algeria on behalf of the Tuareg people. The agreement sought to grant greater autonomy to the north and integrate former rebels into the Malian army. The Algerian government mediated the talks, hoping to stabilize its southern border and prevent the conflict from spilling over. For Ag Ghaly, the accords represented a political victory. He had forced the Malian government to the negotiating table and secured concessions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. However, the accords inadvertently led to the fragmentation of the rebel movement. Other Tuareg factions, wary of Ifaga's dominance and Ag Ghaly's perceived closeness to the traditional hierarchy, splintered from the MPLA to form 4 separate groups. Some believed Ag Ghaly had negotiated a deal that favored his own tribe at the expense of others. Some resented his leadership style, which was authoritarian and uncompromising. Some simply wanted a larger share of the benefits that would flow from peace. Ag Ghaly's influence among the Ifoghas remained strong, but his ability to speak for all Tuareg was now contested. Despite the fragmentation, Ag Ghaly remained the primary interlocutor for the Malian government. Between 1991 and 1996, he navigated a precarious path between armed resistance and political accommodation. The rebellion cooled as Bamako made limited concessions. Some former rebels were integrated into the army, though they were often given low-ranking positions with little real authority. Development projects were promised for the north, though few materialized. The government's approach was to buy time rather than address the underlying grievances. In 1996, thousands of weapons were publicly burned in Timbuktu during the Flame of Peace ceremony. The event was meant to symbolize the end of the rebellion and the beginning of a new era of cooperation between the North and the South. Ag Ghaly attended the ceremony and participated in the weapon destruction. For a moment, it seemed as though peace might hold. Ag Ghaly entered a phase of normalization with the state. He took on roles as a mediator and occasional government advisor. Western diplomats began to see him as a proverbial bad penny, a man who appeared whenever a crisis required a Tuareg intermediary. His primary motivation during this period seemed to be personal gain through facilitating money transactions between rebels and the government. He wasn't ideological, he was transactional. He positioned himself as the indispensable man, the only figure who could bridge the gap between Bamako and the north. This role brought him wealth and influence, but it also made him dependent on maintaining a certain level of instability. If the north became truly stable, his services would no longer be needed. As the rebellion cooled, Ag Ghaly turned his attention to the shadow economies of the Sahara. The vast, ungoverned spaces of northern Mali provided the perfect environment for smuggling networks. These routes originally transported licit goods like subsidized food and fuel from Algeria. The Algerian government heavily subsidized basic commodities, making them far cheaper than in neighboring countries. Traders would buy goods in Algeria and transport them south through Mali to markets in Niger, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. The profit margins were substantial, and the trade was technically legal, though the Algerian government frowned upon it. By the 1980s and 1990s, the routes had evolved to include more lucrative contraband. Ag Ghaly leveraged his control over the Adrar des Ifoghas to establish a predatory taxation system on these convoys. The social infrastructure of the region, built on tribal loyalties and traditional trade routes, became the backbone of an illicit economy. Convoy leaders would negotiate with Ag Ghaly's representatives before entering his territory. They would pay a fee based on the value of their cargo. In return, they received safe passage and protection from bandits and rival groups. If they refused to pay, their convoys would be seized, and their drivers would be lucky to escape with their lives. Cigarettes were among the first commodities to generate significant revenue. Trans-Saharan routes connected free trade zones in North Africa to West African markets. A single convoy could carry thousands of cartons of cigarettes purchased duty-free in Libya or Algeria. When sold in Nigeria or Senegal, the profits could reach tens of thousands of dollars per trip. Ag Ghaly's network provided armed escorts and safe passage certificates. The convoys paid a fee, usually a percentage of the cargo's value. If they refused, they didn't make it through. The cigarette trade was low risk and high reward, requiring minimal investment and generating steady income. Small arms followed. Residual Libyan stockpiles and West African black markets supplied regional militias and insurgent groups. After the end of the Cold War, the Sahel was flooded with weapons from conflicts in Libya, Chad, and Algeria. Ag Ghaly's fighters distributed the weapons and took a cut. The arms trade was more dangerous than cigarette smuggling because governments paid closer attention to weapons flows, but it was also more profitable. A Kalashnikov purchased in Libya for $100 could be sold in Nigeria for $500 or more. Rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and explosives commanded even higher prices. By the early 2000s, cocaine transit had emerged as the most profitable sector. West African ports became transit hubs for South American cocaine heading to Europe. Cartels in Colombia and Venezuela would ship cocaine across the Atlantic to Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, or Sierra Leone. From there, the drugs would be transported overland through Mali and Algeria before crossing the Mediterranean to Spain and Italy. Clandestine landing strips appeared in the desert. Small planes would land in the middle of the night, unload their cargo, and disappear before dawn. Ag Ghaly's network protected the convoys and controlled the airstrips. The profits from cocaine smuggling dwarfed everything else. A single shipment could generate millions of dollars. Human trafficking routes also passed through his territory. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa heading toward Libya paid passage taxes at transit hubs controlled by Ag Ghaly's associates. The journey from West Africa to the Mediterranean was long and dangerous. Migrants traveled through Niger and Mali before entering Libya. At each stage, they paid fees to local power brokers who controlled the routes. Ag Ghaly's network operated some of these transit hubs, charging migrants for food, water, and transportation. The human trafficking trade was less profitable per person than drugs or weapons, but the volume was enormous. Thousands of migrants passed through northern Mali every year. This economic power provided Ag Ghaly with the resources to maintain his influence even when he wasn't in open rebellion. He effectively held the balance of power in the north. If he switched sides, the stability of the entire region would fluctuate accordingly. The Malian government understood this dynamic and tolerated his activities as long as he kept the north relatively quiet. The international community, focused on terrorism and regional stability, largely ignored the smuggling networks because they seemed less threatening than jihadist groups. His status was further cemented by his entry into the high-stakes world of kidnapping for ransom. In 1999 and 2003, he served as a critical intermediary in the release of Western hostages held by the Salafist group for call and combat, the precursor to al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. These negotiations brought in substantial commissions and allowed Ag Ghaly to cultivate high-level contacts within the emerging jihadist movements in the Sahara. He wasn't a jihadist yet, but he was becoming useful to them. He understood how to negotiate with European governments. He understood how to move money without leaving a trail, and he understood that hostages were valuable assets that could be traded for cash, political concessions, or the release of imprisoned fighters. The transformation of Iyad Ag Ghaly from a secular whiskey-drinking Tuareg nationalist into a radical Islamist leader is one of the most significant shifts in Sahelian history. This transition wasn't instantaneous. It was the result of overlapping religious and political influences that accumulated over more than a decade. In the late 1990s, Ag Ghaly encountered members of the Tablighi Jamaat, a Pakistani-origin missionary movement that had established a presence in Kidal. The Tablighi Jamaat is a quietist movement that focuses on personal piety rather than political action. Its members travel in small groups, visiting mosques and communities to encourage Muslims to return to what they consider authentic Islamic practice. Their message of a return to a pure fundamentalist Islam began to resonate with Ag Ghaly. The Tablighi Jamaat emphasized prayer, modesty, and strict adherence to religious obligations. They criticized what they saw as cultural innovations and un-Islamic practices that had become common in West African Islam, including the veneration of saints, the use of amulets, and the blending of Islam with pre-Islamic traditions. For Ag Ghaly, who had spent decades in a world of violence, smuggling, and political maneuvering, the Tablighi message offered a sense of moral clarity and purpose. He abandoned his former lifestyle and adopted a more austere religious practice. He began praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, and studying the Quran. He stopped drinking alcohol and smoking. He grew a beard and began wearing traditional Islamic dress. His associates noticed the change, though many dismissed it as a passing phase. But for Ag Ghaly, the religious transformation was profound. It provided him with a new identity and a new framework for understanding his struggle against the Malian state. In 2008, President Amadou Toumani Touré sought to sideline Ag Ghaly by appointing him as a diplomat to the Malian consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The intent was to remove him from the volatile Kidal region. Touré believed that by giving Ag Ghaly a prestigious position far from his power base, he could neutralize him as a political threat. The strategy backfired. In Saudi Arabia, Ag Ghaly experienced a profound religious rebirth. He grew a large beard and began meeting with unnamed jihadists within the kingdom. Saudi Arabia in the late 2000s was a complicated place for Islamist movements. The Saudi government officially promoted Wahhabism, an ultra-conservative form of Islam, while simultaneously cracking down on jihadist groups that challenged the monarchy's authority. But the kingdom was also home to a vast network of clerics, charities, and activists who supported jihadist movements abroad. Ag Ghaly connected with some of these networks. He attended lectures by extremist clerics, He met individuals who had fought in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and Iraq. He began to see his struggle in Mali not as a nationalist movement, but as part of a global jihad against Western imperialism and secular governments. His contacts with extremists eventually became so blatant that the Saudi government declared him persona non grata and expelled him in 2010. The expulsion was a humiliation, but it also solidified Ag Ghaly's status as a committed jihadist. He returned to Mali with a new mission. He was no longer interested in negotiating autonomy for the Tuareg. He wanted to establish an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. Returning to Mali, Ag Ghaly found a Tuareg community on the brink of another upheaval. The 2011 collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya had sent thousands of heavily armed Tuareg fighters back to Mali. Gaddafi had employed Tuareg mercenaries in his security forces, and when his regime fell, these fighters fled south with truckloads of weapons. The return of these fighters destabilized an already fragile situation. They brought with them advanced weaponry, including anti-aircraft missiles, heavy machine guns, and armored vehicles. Ag Ghaly initially attempted to take control of the newly formed National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, a secular independence group. The MNLA was dominated by young, educated Tuareg who had returned from Libya. They wanted independence for the north, not an Islamic state. They saw Ag Ghaly's religious extremism as a threat to their nationalist goals. When Ag Ghaly tried to assert leadership over the MNLA, he was rejected. The MNLA leadership, dominated by noble Tuareg clans who viewed Ag Ghaly's newfound religious extremism with suspicion, turned him away. Infuriated by this rejection, and realizing that his traditional power base was eroding, Ag Ghaly utilized his AQAM contacts and his personal fortune to form Ansar Dine in late 2011. The name means Defenders of the Faith. The group's stated goal was to impose Sharia law across Mali. Ag Ghaly recruited heavily from among the returning Libyan fighters, offering them salaries and a sense of purpose. He also brought in foreign jihadists from Algeria, Mauritania, and beyond. Ansar Dine was better funded and better armed than the MNLA. It had the backing of AQM, which provided logistical support, training, and access to international jihadist networks. Ag Ghaly had crossed a line. He was no longer a nationalist, he was a jihadist. This transformation was strategic as well as ideological. The nationalist movement had rejected him, and the Malian government had sidelined him. But the global jihadist movement offered him a new base of support and a new source of legitimacy. By aligning himself with Al-Qaeda, Ag Ghaly positioned himself at the center of a transnational network that could provide him with resources, fighters, and ideological cover for his ambitions. The year 2012 marked the zenith of Ag Ghaly's power. While the MNLA launched a secular rebellion for an independent Azawad, Ansar Dine, backed by the military and financial might of AQIM, pursued a radical Islamist agenda. Ag Ghaly's strategy was to allow the MNLA to engage the Malian army in the initial stages of battle, only for his better-equipped Islamist fighters to move in and seize control of the newly captured territories. This tactic exploited the MNLA's military successes while undermining their political goals. In January 2012, Ansar Dine and its allies were responsible for the massacre at Agwel Haq, where approximately 150 Malian soldiers were summarily executed after being captured. The soldiers had surrendered after being surrounded and running out of ammunition. Rather than taking them prisoner, the jihadist fighters executed them. Some were shot, others had their throats cut. The bodies were left in the desert for days before the Malian government could retrieve them. This brutality sent shockwaves through the Malian military. The massacre had a strategic purpose. It was designed to terrorize the Malian army and break its will to fight. The message was clear: surrender meant death. Soldiers stationed in remote northern outposts began to desert. Units refused orders to deploy to the north. Morale collapsed. On March 22, 2012, a group of junior officers launched a coup in Bamako, citing the government's inability to handle the northern rebellion. Captain Amadou Sanogo, who led the coup, appeared on television in military fatigues and announced that the army had taken control of the country. The state was paralyzed. Exploiting this vacuum, Ag Ghaly's forces captured the strategic towns of Tessalit, Kidal, Gao, and finally Timbuktu between January and April 2012. In each town, the pattern was the same. The MNLA would engage the Malian army, forcing them to retreat. Then Ansar Dine and AQM fighters would move in and declare that the town was now under Islamic law. The MNLA, lacking the resources to fight a two-front war, was gradually pushed aside. In Timbuktu, Ag Ghaly and Akim established a dual governance structure that imposed a draconian version of Sharia law. Residents were subjected to public floggings for smoking or listening to music. Amputations were carried out in the city center for crimes like theft. Women were forced into strict gender segregation and subjected to arbitrary dress codes. They were required to wear full-body coverings and were forbidden from leaving their homes without a male guardian. Systematic rape and sexual slavery became tools of control. Women and girls were taken as forced brides by jihadist fighters. Those who resisted were beaten or killed. Secular schools and teacher training centers were closed. The jihadists viewed Western-style education as a threat to their authority. Teachers were targeted, and some were executed for refusing to cooperate. Intellectuals and educators fled the city or went into hiding. The imposition of Islamic education meant that children were taught only the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence. Math, science, history, and literature were banned as un-Islamic subjects. The city's historic Sufi shrines and tombs, which the Islamists deemed idolatrous, were systematically destroyed. Timbuktu had been a center of Islamic scholarship for centuries. Its earthen tombs housed the remains of saints and scholars who had built the city's reputation as a place of learning. The jihadists viewed the veneration of these tombs as shirk, or idolatry, which they believed was one of the gravest sins in Islam. Using pickaxes and sledgehammers, they demolished tomb after tomb. Centuries-old earthen structures that had survived the desert climate were reduced to rubble in a matter of weeks. UNESCO heritage sites were obliterated. The destruction was filmed and broadcast online as a warning to other communities. The jihadists were sending a message. There would be no compromise, no negotiation, no tolerance for practices they deemed un-Islamic. The occupation of Timbuktu became a symbol of jihadist extremism in the Sahel. International media coverage focused on the destruction of the tombs, generating global outrage. The MNLA, once allies, were branded criminals by Ag Ghaly's forces and were eventually pushed out of the major cities. The MNLA leadership fled to Mauritania or went underground. Some fighters joined Ansar Dine, either out of ideological conviction or because they needed the salaries and protection that Ag Ghaly's organization could provide. By mid-2012, Ag Ghaly was the master of northern Mali, controlling a territory larger than France. He maintained a theocratic regime that stood in stark opposition to Tuareg cultural foundations. Traditional Tuareg Islam was syncretic, tolerant, and deeply influenced by Sufism. Ag Ghaly's version was rigid, intolerant, and imported from the Middle East. The occupation lasted until January 2013, when French forces launched Operation Serval. The French government, alarmed by the prospect of a jihadist state on Europe's doorstep, deployed 4,000 troops, supported by air power and special forces. Confronted by superior air power and mechanized infantry, Ag Ghaly's fighters retreated into the Adrar des Ifogas, returning to the guerrilla tactics they had mastered over the previous decades. The French advance was swift. Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal were recaptured within weeks, but Ag Ghaly had already disappeared into the mountains. Despite the loss of his urban strongholds, Ag Ghaly's influence remained paramount. In the years following the French intervention, the jihadist landscape in the Sahel became increasingly fragmented. Multiple groups competed for territory, recruits, and funding. There was AQM's Sahara branch, operating primarily in Algeria and northern Mali. There was Al-Murabitoun, led by Mokhtar Belmokhtar, a veteran jihadist known for his involvement in high-profile kidnappings and attacks. There was the Matina Liberation Front, operating in central Mali and recruiting primarily from the Fulani ethnic group. Each group had its own leader, its own territory, and its own approach to jihad. Recognizing that survival depended on unity, Ag Ghaly spearheaded a massive organizational merger. The negotiations took months. Leaders met in secret locations across the Sahel. Ag Ghaly used his reputation and his connections to broker deals between rival factions. He promised that a unified organization would be more effective at resisting French and Malian counterterrorism operations. He argued that fragmentation was weakening the jihad and allowing secular governments to pick off groups one by one. In March 2017, Ansar Dine, the Sahara branch of Akim, Al-Murabitoun, and the Massina Liberation Front announced they were merging into a single entity. Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin. The name means Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. Ag Ghaly was appointed the overall emir of JNM, pledging his group's allegiance to al-Qaeda's global leadership. The merger was announced in a video message in which Ag Ghaly appeared alongside other senior commanders. The message was clear. The jihadists in the Sahel were now operating under a unified command structure. This merger was a masterstroke of political engineering. By bringing the Fulani-dominated Makana Liberation Front, led by Amadou Kufa, under his umbrella, Ag Ghaly expanded the jihad from the Tuareg-centric north into the densely populated central regions of Mali and eventually into Burkina Faso and Niger. The Makana Liberation Front had been recruiting heavily from Fulani communities who felt marginalized by the Malian government. Fulani herders were engaged in increasingly violent conflicts with sedentary farming communities over access to land and water. Kufa exploited these grievances, framing the conflict as a jihad against corrupt elites and ethnic discrimination. JNIM became the most potent al-Qaeda affiliate in the world. By some estimates, JNIM was responsible for approximately 64% of all violent occurrences in the Sahel. The group operated with a level of sophistication that set it apart from other jihadist organizations. It maintained a decentralized command structure that allowed local commanders to adapt to regional conditions, while still coordinating large-scale operations. Regional emirs controlled specific territories and had the autonomy to launch attacks, collect taxes, and recruit fighters without waiting for approval from Ag Ghaly. The organization invested heavily in propaganda, producing videos and radio broadcasts in multiple languages. JNIM's media wing released slickly produced videos showing fighters training, delivering sermons, and carrying out attacks. These videos were distributed through social media and encrypted messaging apps, reaching audiences across the Sahel and beyond. Radio broadcasts were particularly effective in rural areas where literacy rates were low and internet access was limited. JNM operated clandestine radio stations that broadcast religious programming, news, and propaganda. JNM embedded itself in local communities by providing services that the absent state could not deliver. In areas under JNM control, the group mediated disputes, provided basic health care, and even collected taxes. Disputes over land, marriage, and inheritance were adjudicated by JNM's Sharia courts. While the justice dispensed was harsh and often brutal, it was also swift and predictable, which many communities preferred to the corruption and delays of the formal legal system. Healthcare was minimal, consisting mostly of first aid and traditional medicine, but in areas where government clinics had closed or were never built, even this basic service generated goodwill. The line between governance and insurgency was deliberately blurred. JNIM was not simply a terrorist organization. It was a proto-state, providing security, justice, and basic services in exchange for loyalty and resources. This approach made JNIM more resilient than groups that relied solely on violence and intimidation. Communities that benefited from JNM's governance were less likely to cooperate with government forces or provide intelligence to counter terrorism operations. Under JNM, the kidnapping for ransom industry reached unprecedented levels of scale and sophistication. While the group also diversified its income through artisanal gold mining and cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom remained its primary financial engine. In 2017, kidnapping for ransom accounted for an estimated 40% of JNIM's annual revenue. The group developed a sophisticated system for identifying, capturing, and negotiating the release of hostages. Between 2008 and 2014, European countries allegedly paid an estimated $125 million to liberate hostages in the region. The payments were officially denied by most governments, which maintained public policies against paying ransoms. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Hostages were released after prolonged negotiations involving intermediaries, and JNIM's operational capacity increased dramatically following these releases. The ransom payments allowed JNIM to purchase advanced weaponry, recruit more fighters, and expand its operations. Ag Ghaly's network utilized this capital to buy advanced military hardware, produce sophisticated propaganda, and secure the loyalty of local leaders through financial patronage. The weapons purchased with ransom money included anti-aircraft missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, and explosives. These weapons made JNIM a formidable opponent for the poorly equipped Malian army and even posed challenges for French forces. The propaganda machine, funded by ransom money, allowed JNIM to compete with the Islamic State for recruits and international attention. The process of negotiation became a refined economic model, handled via burner phones, encrypted communication, and the informal hawala banking system. Mediators, often described as questionable businessmen, bridged the gap between the desert and international governments. These intermediaries took their own commissions, sometimes as much as 20% of the ransom, but they ensured that cash flowed into JNEM's coffers. The hawala system allowed money to move across borders without leaving a paper trail. A family in Europe would deposit money with a hawala broker, who would then instruct a counterpart in the Sahel to pay JNEM the equivalent amount. In 2020, JNEM secured one of its most significant ransom payments. Sophie Petronin, a French aid worker, and Soumaïla Cissé, a Malian opposition leader, were released in exchange for 10 million euros and the release of 204 JNEM members. Petronin had been held for nearly 4 years. Cissé had been kidnapped while campaigning for the presidency. The negotiations were complex and involved multiple intermediaries. The French government officially denied paying a ransom, but the release of 204 prisoners, many of whom were high-ranking JNIM commanders, suggests otherwise. This exchange provided JNIM with a massive boost to its local operational capacity and morale. The freed fighters returned to the field with renewed legitimacy. They were hailed as heroes who had been liberated through jihad. Their release demonstrated to JNIM's rank and file that the organization took care of its members and would negotiate for their freedom. The cash allowed JNIM to expand its operations across the Sahel, opening new fronts in Burkina Faso and Niger. In 2025, JNIM targeted a different demographic. An Emirati sheikh and prince were kidnapped and held for ransom. The targeting of wealthy Middle Eastern nationals represented a shift in JNIM's strategy. Previously, the group had focused on Western hostages because European governments were more likely to pay ransoms. But wealthy individuals from Gulf states represented even more lucrative targets. Reports suggest the ransom payment ranged between $20 and $50 million, with additional military hardware included in the deal. This influx of capital allowed JNM to survive multiple international counterterrorism operations. Ag Ghaly's ability to use mediators ensured that his organization remained flush with cash even when its territory was contested. The kidnapping economy was not just about money. It was about demonstrating power, generating international attention, and forcing governments to engage with JNM as a political actor rather than a criminal organization. The kidnapping economy also served a strategic purpose beyond financing. It demonstrated JNM's reach and its ability to operate with impunity. Western tourists, aid workers, and business people were vulnerable anywhere in the Sahel. The threat of kidnapping discouraged foreign investment and undermined government efforts to attract development aid. It sent a message to foreign governments that their citizens were vulnerable and that JNIM could strike anywhere. It forced governments to engage in negotiations which legitimized JNIM as a political actor. By sitting down at the negotiating table, even indirectly through mediators, governments acknowledged JNIM's power and its ability to extract concessions. Each successful negotiation reinforced JNIM's status as a force that could not be ignored. Ag Ghaly understood that every ransom payment was both a financial transaction and a political victory. For years, Ag Ghaly's cat-like immunity from capture or death made him a figure of mythic proportions in the Sahara. Stories circulated about his ability to evade drone strikes, his use of body doubles, and his network of informants who warned him of impending operations. However, the international community began to systematically dismantle his legal and financial protections. In February 2013, both the United Nations and the United States designated him as a specially designated global terrorist. This designation imposed asset freezes, travel bans, and arms embargoes. Any entity found to be doing business with Ag Ghaly faced severe penalties. His ability to move money through formal banking systems was severely restricted. Banks that processed transactions linked to Ag Ghaly risked losing access to the international financial system. His capacity to travel outside the Sahel was eliminated. Any country that allowed him entry would face diplomatic consequences and potential sanctions. The designation also had symbolic importance. It signaled that Ag Ghaly was no longer a Tuareg rebel or a negotiator. He was a terrorist, and any government that dealt with him would be complicit in terrorism. This designation made it increasingly difficult for Ag Ghaly to maintain the dual identity he had cultivated for decades, that of both a jihadist leader and a Tuareg political broker. The most significant legal escalation occurred on June 21, 2024, when the International Criminal Court unsealed an arrest warrant for Ag Ghaly. The warrant had been issued under seal in 2017, meaning that for 7 years, Ag Ghaly had been wanted by the ICC without knowing it. The decision to keep the warrant sealed was strategic. The ICC did not want to alert Ag Ghaly to the investigation, which might have allowed him to destroy evidence or flee to a country beyond the court's jurisdiction. The charges were comprehensive. They related to his actions in Timbuktu and Aguelhok between January 2012 and January 2013. The warrant included war crimes such as the murder of soldiers hors de combat, meaning soldiers who had surrendered or were otherwise out of action. The execution of 150 soldiers at Aguelhok fell squarely within this category. The warrant also charged Ag Ghaly with rape and sexual slavery, recognizing the systematic sexual violence perpetrated by Ansar Dine fighters against women and girls in Timbuktu. Mutilation and torture were included as war crimes. The public amputations carried out in Timbuktu, while justified by Ansar Dine as Islamic punishments, constituted torture under international law. The destruction of religious buildings, including the Sufi tombs, was charged as a war crime. The ICC recognized that the destruction of cultural heritage was not merely vandalism, but an attack on the identity and dignity of the affected communities. The warrant also included crimes against humanity, a category reserved for the most serious offenses. Imprisonment and severe deprivation of liberty referred to the arbitrary detention of individuals in Timbuktu who were accused of violating Sharia law. Many were held in brutal conditions without trial or legal representation. Torture was charged as a crime against humanity, recognizing that it was part of a systematic policy rather than isolated incidents. Persecution on religious and gender grounds acknowledged that Ansar Dine had targeted specific groups, including Sufis, women, and secular intellectuals, for systematic abuse. The unsealing of this warrant marked the end of Ag Ghaly's potential as a legitimate negotiator. It signaled to all member states and regional powers that any transaction with Ag Ghaly would be a violation of international law. Human rights groups welcomed the ICC's decision as a critical step toward justice for the victims of the horrific abuses committed by Ansar Dine. Organizations that had documented the atrocities in Timbuktu saw the warrant as vindication of their work and a message that impunity would not be tolerated. While Ag Ghaly remains at large, the warrant effectively turned him into a permanent international fugitive. His ability to operate openly or use intermediaries was severely restricted. Governments that had once negotiated with him could no longer do so without facing international condemnation. Mediators who had facilitated hostage negotiations became more cautious, knowing that their involvement could be construed as aiding a wanted war criminal. The final phase of the hunt for Iyad Ag Ghaly began with a radical shift in Mali's security alliances. Following a series of coups, the Malian military junta expelled French forces and the UN's MINUSMA mission. The junta, led by Colonel Assimi Goïta, accused the French of failing to defeat the jihadists and of pursuing their own interests rather than Mali's security. Anti-French sentiment had been building for years, fueled by civilian casualties from French airstrikes and the perception that France was more interested in protecting its economic interests than in helping Mali. The junta turned instead to the Russian Wagner Group for security assistance. Wagner, a private military company with close ties to the Kremlin, had been expanding its operations across Africa. It offered a different model of engagement. No lectures about human rights, no demands for democratic reforms, just security services in exchange for payment and access to resources. By early 2022, hundreds of Wagner mercenaries had deployed to Mali. They brought a reactive and violent strategy that targeted both jihadist groups and the civilian population suspected of supporting them. Massacres of civilians became routine. Wagner forces and their Malian counterparts carried out operations in villages suspected of harboring jihadists. In some cases, entire villages were destroyed. Men of fighting age were executed. Women and children were left to flee into the desert. Human rights organizations documented multiple incidents in which Wagner forces summarily executed civilians, sometimes based on nothing more than ethnic profiling or unverified accusations. Villages were razed. The brutality was intended to terrorize communities into withdrawing their support for Jenim, but it often had the opposite effect. driving more people into the arms of the jihadists. This escalation reached a bloody climax in July 2024. A convoy of approximately 30 vehicles, comprised of Wagner, mercenaries, and Malian soldiers, left Tessalit on a mission to reclaim northern territory. The convoy was heavily armed, carrying anti-aircraft guns, mortars, and armored vehicles. The plan was to push north toward the Algerian border, clearing JNIM positions and establishing a permanent military presence in the region. On July 25th, within 10 kilometers of the village of Tinzaouaten, the convoy was ambushed by a coalition of secular Tuareg rebels from the CSP-DPA and JNIM fighters. A massive sandstorm grounded Malian air support, leaving the ground forces to face a coordinated assault in unfamiliar territory. The sandstorm reduced visibility to near zero and made it impossible for helicopters to provide cover or evacuation. The attackers, intimately familiar with the terrain, used the sandstorm to their advantage. They surrounded the convoy and launched a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The battle lasted hours. Wagner forces, trained for operations in Syria and Ukraine, struggled to adapt to the desert environment. The aftermath of the battle was a catastrophe for the Wagner-Malian alliance. The CSP-DPA claimed to have killed 84 Russian mercenaries and 47 Malian soldiers. JNIM militants took control of the escaping remnants of the convoy. Videos circulated online showing captured Wagner fighters being executed. Bodies were left in the desert. The images were a propaganda victory for JNIM, demonstrating that even Russia's elite mercenaries could be defeated in the Sahara. The defeat was so severe that it shattered Wagner's reputation in Africa. For years, Wagner had marketed itself as an effective alternative to Western military assistance. Tinzaouaten demonstrated that Russian mercenaries were just as vulnerable as anyone else in the Sahara. Clients in other African countries began to question whether Wagner could deliver on its promises. The Russian government, embarrassed by the defeat, sought to distance itself from the disaster. By August 2025, the Wagner Group announced its formal withdrawal from Mali. The Russian government replaced Wagner with the more state-controlled Africa Corps. While the Malian junta claimed mission accomplished, the reality was that JNIM and Ag Ghaly had successfully repelled a major challenge to their territorial control. The Battle of Tinzaouaten became a symbol of JNIM's resilience. It showed that the group could coordinate with secular rebels when necessary. It demonstrated that foreign interventions, whether French or Russian, could not dislodge the networks that Ag Ghaly had built. One of the most pressing questions about Ag Ghaly's eventual end is what happens to JNIM after he is gone. Unlike some jihadist organizations that are highly centralized around a single charismatic leader, JNIM has developed a decentralized command structure. Amadou Koufa, the leader of the Messina Liberation Front, operates with a high degree of autonomy in central Mali. He commands thousands of fighters and controls territory spanning multiple provinces. Other regional commanders have their own bases of support and their own revenue streams. This decentralization has made JNIM more resilient, but it also creates the potential for fragmentation. If Ag Ghaly is killed or captured, there is no clear successor who commands the same level of respect across JNIM's diverse factions. Koufa is a powerful figure, but he lacks Ag Ghaly's Tuareg credentials and his long history of negotiation with state actors. Koufa's base of support is primarily among the Fulani, and there is no guarantee that Tuareg fighters would accept his leadership. Other potential successors are either too young, too regional, or too closely associated with AQEM to unify the entire organization. Some commanders, particularly those who came up through AQEM, have strong ties to al-Qaeda's central leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They might push for a more internationalist approach, focusing on attacks against Western targets and coordination with other al-Qaeda affiliates. Other commanders, particularly those with roots in local grievances, might prefer to focus on the Sahel and maintain JNIM's current strategy of embedding itself in local communities. The result could be a splintering of JNIM into multiple competing groups, each vying for control of territory and resources. A hardline faction might emerge that rejects negotiation and focuses on spectacular terrorist attacks. A more pragmatic faction might seek to consolidate control over specific regions and transition from insurgency to governance. Ethnic tensions could also play a role, with Tuareg and Fulani factions competing for dominance. However, fragmentation might not weaken JNIM in the way that governments hope. A splintered JNIM could be more difficult to negotiate with and harder to target militarily. Multiple groups operating independently could spread violence across a wider area, making it harder for any single counterterrorism strategy to succeed. Each splinter group would have its own leadership, its own funding sources, and its own territorial base, making it nearly impossible to eliminate them all simultaneously. The lesson of the Sahel is that killing or capturing a single leader rarely ends the insurgency. When Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, Al-Qaeda did not collapse. It adapted, decentralized, and in some regions grew stronger. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in 2019, the Islamic State lost its symbolic leader, but continued to operate in multiple countries. Ag Ghaly's death or capture might weaken Jenim in the short term, but the underlying conditions that allow the insurgency to thrive remain unchanged. For nearly 40 years, Iyad Ag Ghaly has survived because the desert protected him. The Sahara is not just a geographic feature, it is a strategic asset. The vast distances, the extreme climate, and the difficult terrain make conventional military operations nearly impossible. Armies require supply lines, water, fuel, and shelter. The desert offers none of these. Soldiers stationed in remote outposts face temperatures that can reach 50 degrees Celsius during the day and drop below freezing at night. Vehicles break down in the sand. Helicopters struggle to operate in sandstorms. Local populations, by contrast, know how to navigate the terrain, where to find water, and how to survive in extreme conditions. This knowledge asymmetry has allowed groups like JNIM to operate with near impunity. Tuareg and other Sahelian peoples have survived in the Sahara for centuries. They know which routes avoid detection, which valleys provide shelter, and which watering holes are reliable. They can travel at night using stars for navigation. They can move large groups of people and supplies across vast distances without leaving a detectable trail. The desert also provides a sanctuary from aerial surveillance. Sandstorms ground helicopters and limit the effectiveness of drones. Satellites can photograph the desert, but distinguishing between civilians and fighters is nearly impossible. Heat signatures are unreliable because the desert itself radiates heat. The lack of infrastructure means that there are no roads for convoys to follow, making it difficult to predict where JNM fighters will appear. The population is spread out across vast areas, making it easy for fighters to blend in with civilians. The combination of these factors has made the Sahara a nearly perfect environment for irregular warfare. Conventional militaries designed to fight other conventional militaries struggle to adapt. Special forces can operate in small teams, but they require extensive logistical support and accurate intelligence, both of which are in short supply in the Sahel. Drone strikes can eliminate individual targets, but they cannot hold territory or prevent JNM from regrouping. Ag Ghaly has exploited these advantages better than anyone else. He has turned the desert into a fortress. He has used his Ifoghas heritage to maintain loyalty among local populations. Villagers provide him with food, shelter, and intelligence. They warn him when government forces are approaching. They hide him when necessary. This support network is the foundation of his survival. He has leveraged his knowledge of the terrain to evade capture. He moves constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few days. He travels with a small, trusted entourage that knows how to disappear into the desert. He uses decoys and false information to mislead pursuers. On multiple occasions, intelligence agencies have reported his death, only for him to resurface weeks later. He has built a network that can survive without him, because it is embedded in the social and economic fabric of the region. JNIM is not just a military organization. It is a system of governance, justice, and economic exchange that provides services the state cannot or will not provide. The desert does not just protect Ag Ghaly, it protects the system he created. As the hunt for Iyad Ag Ghaly continues, several questions remain unanswered. The first is whether he is still alive. Some intelligence reports suggest he has been killed in airstrikes or ground operations, but these reports have never been confirmed. JNIM continues to release statements attributed to Ag Ghaly, but it is unclear whether these statements are current or whether they are being released by his followers to maintain the illusion that he is still in command. In jihadist organizations, leaders often record multiple statements in advance precisely to create this ambiguity. The second question is whether capturing or killing Ag Ghaly would make any difference. The history of counterterrorism in the Sahel suggests that removing individual leaders does not end insurgencies. When one leader is killed, another emerges. The system adapts and continues. Ag Ghaly's death might create a temporary disruption, but unless the underlying conditions that allow JNIM to thrive are addressed, the organization will survive. JNIM's decentralized structure means that regional commanders can operate independently. Its economic model, based on smuggling and kidnapping, does not depend on a single leader. The third question is whether there is any scenario in which Ag Ghaly could be brought to trial. The ICC warrant means that any country that captures him would be obligated to turn him over to The Hague. However, the governments of the Sahel have shown little interest in cooperating with the ICC. Mali has not ratified the Rome Statute, the treaty that created the ICC, and is therefore not legally obligated to cooperate. The Malian junta, in particular, has rejected international legal frameworks in favor of a more militarized approach. If Ag Ghaly is captured by Malian or allied forces, it is more likely that he would be executed on the spot rather than extradited to face trial. Bringing him to trial would be a long, expensive, and politically complicated process. It would require cooperation between multiple governments and international institutions. It would give Ag Ghaly a platform to justify his actions and potentially inspire more followers. From the perspective of the Malian junta and its Russian allies, a quick execution would be simpler and more satisfying. There is also the question of whether Ag Ghaly even wants to be captured. Some jihadist leaders seek martyrdom, viewing death in battle as the highest form of religious devotion. Ag Ghaly, however, has consistently prioritized survival. He has spent decades evading capture, suggesting that he values his life and his ability to continue leading JNM. But if cornered, he might prefer death to capture and trial. The story of Iyad Ag Ghaly is ultimately a story about the consequences of state failure. He did not create the instability in the Sahel, he exploited it. He did not invent smuggling networks or kidnapping for ransom, he refined them into a sustainable economic model. He did not introduce jihadist ideology to the region. He weaponized it to consolidate his power. What makes Ag Ghaly exceptional is not his ideology or his brutality. It is his ability to adapt to changing circumstances and to build a system that can survive without him. That system is now deeply embedded in the Sahel. It includes JNM's fighters, who number in the thousands. Estimates suggest JNM can mobilize between 3,000 and 5,000 fighters at any given time, with many more supporters who provide logistical assistance. These fighters are not mercenaries who can be bought off or young men who joined out of desperation. Many are ideologically committed jihadists who believe they are fighting a holy war. Others are embedded in local communities and see JNM as a source of protection and justice. The system includes the smuggling networks that move goods, drugs, and people across borders. These networks generate millions of dollars in revenue every year. They provide employment for thousands of people who have no other economic opportunities. Shutting them down would require international cooperation, massive investment in border security, and alternative economic opportunities for the communities that depend on smuggling. None of these conditions exist. The system includes the corrupt officials who facilitate these operations in exchange for bribes. JNM could not operate without the complicity of government officials, military officers, and local administrators. These individuals provide intelligence, facilitate the movement of weapons and fighters, and turn a blind eye to JNM's activities. Rooting out this corruption would require a fundamental reform of the Malian state, something that seems unlikely given the junta's authoritarian tendencies and its focus on staying in power. The system includes the local communities that depend on JNM for security and justice. In many parts of the Sahel, the state has never provided these services. JNM fills the void, offering protection from bandits, adjudicating disputes, and providing a sense of order. For communities that have been abandoned by the government, JNM is not an occupying force. It is a provider of essential services. Displacing JNM would require the state to step in and provide better governance, something it has consistently failed to do. Dismantling this system would require more than military force. It would require a fundamental transformation of governance in the region. The governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger would need to invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic development in the north and in rural areas. They would need to address the grievances of marginalized communities, including the Tuareg and the Fulani. They would need to root out corruption and build legitimate institutions that people trust. They would need to create economic opportunities so that young men do not see joining JNM as their best option. The governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger show no signs of undertaking such a transformation. They remain focused on short-term military solutions that have failed repeatedly. The Malian junta has prioritized maintaining its grip on power over addressing the underlying causes of instability. Its reliance on Russian mercenaries has alienated traditional allies without improving security. Its attacks on civilian populations have driven more people into JNIM's arms. They continue to rely on foreign partners who do not understand the region and who pursue strategies that often make the situation worse. The French intervention, while initially successful at pushing jihadists out of urban areas, failed to address the root causes of the insurgency. The UN mission was paralyzed by bureaucracy and a restrictive mandate. The Russian intervention has been characterized by brutality and a lack of strategic vision. They ignore the grievances of northern and rural communities, ensuring that those communities will continue to support groups like JNIM. The perception that the government serves only the interests of urban elites in the south is deeply entrenched. Until this perception changes, and until the government demonstrates a genuine commitment to serving all Malians, the insurgency will continue. The chaos that Ag Ghaly built is not just his legacy, it is the region's future. The Sahel is trapped in a cycle of violence, corruption, and state failure that shows no signs of ending. Every year, the situation deteriorates further. More people are displaced, more children are deprived of education, more communities are caught between jihadists, government forces, and foreign mercenaries. The international community has largely given up on the Sahel, focusing instead on containing the violence and preventing it from spreading to coastal West African states. Whether Iyad Ag Ghaly is still alive or already dead, the empire he constructed continues to function. His genius was not in being irreplaceable, but in building a system that didn't need him to survive. He understood that individual leaders are vulnerable, but systems are resilient. He embedded JNIM in the social, economic, and political fabric of the Sahel so deeply that removing him would not dismantle the organization. The Sahel remains trapped in the architecture he helped design, a region where the state is absent, where smuggling routes are more reliable than governance, and where violence is the currency of power. The hunt for Ag Ghaly has consumed billions of dollars and thousands of lives. French helicopters have crisscrossed the desert. American drones have circled overhead. Russian mercenaries have launched ground operations, yet the desert that protected him for 40 years still shelters the network he created. Governments can kill the man. They have not yet figured out how to kill the void. The international arrest warrant, the sanctions, and the military operations may eventually succeed in eliminating Ag Ghaly. But unless the governments of the Sahel address the state failure, corruption, and marginalization that allowed him to thrive, another figure will emerge to fill his role. The system he built will adapt, evolve, and continue. That is the true measure of his success and the deepest reason for concern about the Sahel's future.